Hey, everybody. Happy holidays, and thanks for checking in to our latest Traded Black podcast. I'm your host, Shad Dales. Hope all of you had a great Christmas. As here we are in the holiday season. And I said before Christmas, we're going to have content out every single day, and we continue that trend. And today, we have perhaps one of the biggest interviews of the entire year. It's a Canadian panel with perhaps the three biggest names in the Canadian landscape. Not only the Canadian landscape, but really for the overall cannabis industry. As Bina Goldenberg, Michael DeJulio, and David Klein will join us here on this panel to talk about really the Canadian market, the international market, and the biggest predictions and trends that we should focus on heading into 2025. So with that, let's welcome in first the CEO of Organigram, which trades on the NASDAQ under the ticker symbol OGI, Bina Goldenberg. Happy holidays. How are things?
Very good. Thank you. Same to you for the holidays.
Yeah, great to see you. Next up, CEO of Village Farms, which also trades on the NASDAQ under the ticker symbol VFF. Good friend of the podcast, Michael DeJulio. Good to see you, sir.
Good to see you, Shad. Good to see you, Bina.
Good. And then lastly, want to bring in David Klein, CEO of Canopy Growth, which also trades again on the NASDAQ under the ticker symbol CGC. Happy holidays, David. How are things?
Things are great. Happy holidays to you and everyone out there. And thanks for having me on this panel.
I appreciate it. And a common theme that I was saying off the top, all three companies trade on the NASDAQ. We're going to get into a lot of questions, but first off the top, I was always raised to have ladies go first. So Bina, with that, what's that mean? I think it's often overlooked about how you're on a senior exchange. We've brought this up from time to time, but all three companies here trade on the NASDAQ. Canada has federally legalized cannabis for almost over 6 years now. The early stages of this industry, and I would say the Canadian market, you saw a lot of CEOs that kind of worked on their own. Now that we're 6 years later, we're learning more about the industry. How would you best describe working amongst your peers in the space? Are we seeing more and more of that? And if so, you maybe want to share an example or two?
Sure. So, absolutely. We're 6 years on, and the industry isn't working as well as we had all hoped. There are some regulatory challenges, and we are working much better as an industry, both with our association being Cannabis Council of Canada, combining our efforts to take the messages to our government on some of the key issues, specifically around excise reform, around our digital stamp, around potency caps on edibles, those kind of things. I think it is change. We are working together because we have to, and get the advocacy moving forward. And I think it helps, right? Rather than everybody doing their own thing. Taking the same message, the same point, and taking it forward. We perhaps haven't made as much progress as we would like, but we're starting to see inklings. So that's a good news story for us.
Michael, you seeing, to Bina's point, you seeing more and more of that?
I'm not as optimistic. I mean, I feel like much more has needed to be done in Canada. I mean, I go back to the campaign promises that were made and sit here today and say, name one of those campaign promises other than charging an incredibly ridiculous amount of tax has been kept. And even on this recent economic forum, I mean, there wasn't anything material about the stamp tax, just a mention of it. And that could go on for another year or two. So what I think the companies like us and others you've had to focus completely, very myopically on your operations to make it in this environment because it's very difficult. You look at excise tax. I mean, people, would normally say, hey, I have to work for the government I'm in through, March of each year, and then I could keep the money. I mean, here, and you've heard these numbers from everybody on this call and others. I mean, for us this year alone, it's $100 million. That's without nearly $4 million in licensing tax. What do we get for that? I can't mention one value add that we get for that. And we're working for the Canadian. When you add all taxes, property and payroll, even this year, we're an income tax player, and not just, I'm talking 9-figure income tax. And thank God that we figured out a way to generate that. But we're working cumulatively for the Canadian government pretty much through August before we can generate 1 penny for ourselves. And it's crazy. That 40%, that's higher than loan sharks and organized crime charges and generating revenue for their businesses. So something has to be done. And I wish I wish the politicians would take a leadership position and look at this. And all we're looking for is fairness, right?
Yeah.
Same as alcohol, same as just treat us the way you treat others. Nothing more, nothing less.
David, Michael makes some good points there. Based on some of the conversations, do you agree with a lot of stuff that Michael's saying there? And if so, like when you look and have had conversations with various politicians, like what's the feedback when you bring up these concerns on some of the stuff that you've outlined in the past?
Well, look, it's super frustrating because the feedback is there's a slight understanding of the issue, but everyone tells you it's someone else's job in the government to deal with. We haven't really caught the government's imagination as an economic development engine, as a job engine for the country. And look, we're looking for some really simple things like let's make the excise tax make sense versus other industries. The government needs to crack down on the criminal enterprises out there. You asked Bina the question about how we work together. Well, we're still like, I don't know, being optimistic. We're 60-70% of the industry. We're not even 100% of the industry, right? So I think what we're looking for is pretty simple. We get head nods when we're talking to the government folks, but we don't have anybody that feels like this is an important enough issue for them to move on. Meanwhile, the companies that are trying to do the best that they can to follow the regs and pay taxes are getting killed, and the illicit businesses are doing really well because, as Michael pointed out, like what he just kind of outlined his taxes. If you're an illicit business, that's your operating margin. It's pretty good business.
Yeah, I know this is an important market for all of you, Michael. Like you've actually increased market share, so you've done well, obviously, in this market over the past year. Do you think that there's anything? So you're thinking there's nothing here that they'll review it, but it's kind of like say what you want to say and tell people what they want to hear. That there's real no substance here. Because I was going to ask, do you think there's anything to do with pending regulatory changes in the U.S. and how that might materialize south of the border? Has any kind of impact on how the Canadian government is viewing this, or is that just wishful thinking?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking you, Michael.
I
Sorry.
think it's totally wishful thinking. I think there's no connection there whatsoever. I just see the Canadian leadership not focused on the industry at all. I mean, 14,000 jobs I've heard have been lost. These are jobs just not at the manufacturing cultivation level, but people have moved their entire family thinking this was a great new industry, great CPG industry in Canada.
Yeah.
Tremendous losses there. We're still talking, north of 10,000 people. It's just nobody's acknowledging the industry, and I think looking south of the border for any sort of leadership that can weigh in, I don't think that's happened. In fact, south of the border has their own challenges and promises. So nobody's working together there either to try to have a single strong message going through. And it's unfortunate that we're fragmented and we can't work together stronger, but I can understand it because we're also focused on surviving, under these conditions every day and thriving. So no, I don't see anything happening there, at least now. Maybe 2 years down the road, there may be. That's my thought.
Yeah, let me just say I agree with Michael. I don't think anything that happens in the U.S. is going to make a difference in Canada.
No.
I do think that there's a likely change in government in Canada, and the new government is going to, first of all, is more business friendly, and I think they'll be happy to sort of show what the Liberal government hasn't done and might address some of the issues. Just to put in perspective, Michael mentioned how much excise tax he's paying. I mean, if the excise went to that 10% on flour, which was what the original assumption would be, our EBITDA margins would be over 35%. So when you look at the U.S. and everybody talks about, the fact that EBITDA margins in Canada are much less than the U.S., obviously 280E is below the line. Our excise comes off as part of our EBITDA, but if it just moved to what was originally the assumption, we would have over 35% EBITDA margins, and all of a sudden you have industry, you have profit that you can invest in innovation.
35%. Wow.
It's a game changer. So I agree, we haven't made the progress we need. I think as an industry, we're trying harder to bring a united voice to the government, but it will require a government change for some change to happen.
Yeah. That's big numbers. Like, how much the focal point will this be? I guess, David, I know with the new CEO coming in early next year, but, let's face it, everybody comes together, you bring attention. I had a great call earlier this week on some of the U.S. regulatory changes, and the biggest pressure, obviously, is constituents. That's going to obviously influence a lot of politicians and how they view things, especially if they're up for re-election. And let's face it, in Canada, there's going to be an election coming up relatively soon. How much is this a priority, you think, for yourself and, let's say, the new CEO, and as overall for the company come 2025, to continue echoing this messaging to, like Bina said, something small would be pretty drastic and very favorable for a lot of companies operating within that market?
Oh, well, we're going to continue to drive that really hard, working with the other members of the industry. I think the difficulty is you look at the Canadian market, and the Canadian government should almost deserves an economic courage premium for being the first major country to come out and move forward with legalized cannabis. And instead, it's almost as if they legalized cannabis and then said, well, now we don't want to talk about it ever again.
Exactly.
And so they launched an industry that's flawed. The economic model in Canada isn't sustainable over the long run. And you can go at it from one of 2 points. You can either say you need to lower excise and change the excise regime, of course, or you can get rid of the illicit market. But as long as the criminal market is there, we almost have to price as if we're like in an oligopoly. So we have to match their prices, and then they don't pay the taxes or have the oversight that we have. And so to me, that's so important. It's foundational for the long-term success for the Canadian cannabis industry. And we should have the best industry in the world because we were first, and that will affect exports and our ability to develop unique products that we can take elsewhere in the world. That benefit should be accruing to the Canadian economy, the Canadian LPs, and it simply isn't because the model's flawed.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, and I can just add one thing. I mean, it's sort of a slap in the face. To David's point, instead of the rest of the world that's starting to look at cannabis, instead of looking at Canada as the model, even if the original model that Canada put out wasn't perfect, they have done nothing in 6 or 7 years to tweak it, nothing on the regulatory side. So nobody's looking at Canada anymore. I can tell you, if you're focused on the international market, that's not the model they're following. And that's really unfortunate. Totally. So, that's just another example. The other is on capital investment.
Yeah.
So one of the things that happens if you look at consolidation, whether you believe in it or not, what happens in consolidation is you do a consolidation to be more efficient. So you're going to lose jobs, right? You're going to integrate and streamline. So job losses will occur, even if there's another reason for doing the M&A side and consolidation. But we're not making investments. We wanted to make an investment this year. We could have, but just the return on capital versus other opportunities is not there. So we would have added probably 200 organic jobs, and we're not making that because the returns are better elsewhere. And that's a shame.
Yeah, really you're right. And you're right. If we take maybe
and the other thing, just on the illicit trade, on David's point, I mean, it's a slap in the face. If you don't pay your excise tax, it's like playing Monopoly. You get a pass. You don't go to jail. You just wipe out your excise tax and you continue on. You don't even lose your license. So what is that saying for everybody struggling to make it, keep people employed, when others can just wipe their slate clean and re-enter? It's just ludicrous, insane.
Well, the reason why I think companies like yourselves have obviously pivoted, and let's face it, it's a rapidly growing industry, and we look at this international market, and it's a lucrative one as to what's going on right now. Like, we look at the Canadian market, it has shown signs of growth, and you all have begun to capitalize, as I said, on the global cannabis market as it takes shape. Bina, what do you think was the most important thing to happen this year that applies to the industry and your company specifically, knowing as we prepare for 2025 and the more and more headlines and press releases that we read amongst the three companies here today, is that the international market is an important one. So you want to maybe elaborate on some of that?
Yes, absolutely. So I think for us, Germany, we see as, becoming the second largest legal market at some point down the road. Yeah. And the really big thing that happened this year with the decriminalization as of April 1st all of a sudden you see the German market, remember, just medical growing 3 to 4 times the size very quickly. Just the stat that I find really interesting is currently the estimate in Germany is 0.5% of the population is a cannabis patient. And you compare that to more mature markets that have had medical cannabis available, like Israel, which is at 2%, or Australia, that's at 3.5%. And you see the upside potential of Germany, even still in a very restricted medical market. So see that market is going to grow. We invested $21 million into the Sanity Group to be part of that growth down the road. There was just last week, or a couple of weeks ago, an enactment talking about potentially introducing rec pilot programs in Germany. Sanity Group has applied for Berlin, Frankfurt, and Hanover. We think this is a really exciting market. And back to your comment earlier, are other countries looking at Canada? They're looking at Canada as a cautionary tale, what not to do. And I think Germany is approaching it in a much more measured approach, a much smarter way. Really, there's the lack of the capital up front, so they're doing it through, bringing in product from other markets. And yes, a couple of supply constraints as the market is growing, but really exciting. And I think certainly people with EU GMP that will get product into that market faster are in here. So I think that's important.
Well, when we look at this industry, Michael, you said that the federal government has done nothing once it legalized cannabis. And let's face it, this cannabis industry changes rapidly over like 3-4 months every single year. And it's been 6 years. You talk about being transformative, Dave. It's something that your company has been no stranger to. And you look at over the last 12 months and some of the changes that you've had to make. When you look at this past year as to what's happened, and looking into 2025, furthering to what Beena has said, like, how are you approaching this from the international level? Because there's a lot of investment, as I said off the top, that companies like yourselves are focusing on this. So how are you best approaching 2025 based on the international market?
Yeah, so I think we've seen kind of how markets open. Whether you look at an individual state, or you look at Canada, or you look at Germany or Poland, pick the market, Australia, and we see the same trend, right? So you see there's a lot of exuberance up front. There's really good margins to have, really, because there's not enough product available on the shelf. Then kind of capacity gets overbuilt, and then there's price compression, right? So we're being careful about just focusing our presence on a market like Germany, a market like Poland, a market like Australia. Probably not going to go much beyond that, and just kind of see how it unfolds. I think the other thing that we've all learned is that, at one time people felt you needed to be first in a market in order to be successful. You can look at maybe the most advanced market in the world, which is California. I don't think any of the top 5 brands 5 years ago are even available in California. And I might be slightly wrong on that, but they're certainly not the top 5 brands anymore, right? So I think we need to be very measured. And so we've chosen, in addition to investing our time and energy on creating our partner company, Canopy USA, in the US, we've chosen to be asset light everywhere else, so that we can be nimble and react to changes in the regulatory environments, as these countries evolve.
Yeah, and I think the American market is something that all of you have a strong focal point on to be major players, knowing you have U.S. aspirations. One last thing before we leave the international topic, Michael, what do you see, I guess, as the biggest growth potentials, the main drivers for that industry into 2025?
Well, I think we're all bullish on international because it starts with the foundation of Canada. I mean, listen to what Beena said, what the international countries, and I agree with her 100%. They're looking at Canada as what not to do. And, it can't help but be passionate about it. What is going on here, as David said, with the illicit trade is half the market. So if we're at $5 billion, instead of concentrating in Canada, how do we get to $10 billion and cannibalize the illicit trade? How many jobs would that be? And with the right tax structure and excise, you can do it, because a true measure of business is it sustainably can pay income tax. And at the rate of 50%, if we grew it to 10 billion with the right excise tax that would bring in capital to grow, the Canadian government would still end up in the same place, only they would be doing it with creating very durable, viable, long-term businesses. So unfortunately, we can't sit here and make investments to get to the 10 billion without those changes like illicit trade. But how unfortunate when a country like Canada takes such a bold and courageous move to legalize cannabis recreational on a world scale, and then be the one 6 years later that the rest of the country is looking, at least
I
over
know.
the next 10 or 15 years, saying what not to do. So yes, I agree. We are not first in anywhere, and including international. But of course, we're all going for it because it financially makes sense. You have to be patient in this industry, and we're very focused on it. And we think the next 2 to 3 years are more exciting and international based on the fundamentals, the regulatory theater that we're seeing in Canada and the USA. So many unknowns that we have to go there and see how it rolls out. For us, I mean, we're aligned with everyone, of my colleagues here on the medicinal side and where that may go. We've taken a bold step in the Netherlands, as you know, on the recreational side, and again, just to mirror what Bina said, it's a much more pragmatic approach by the politicians there. They want the industry to succeed.
When you say pragmatic, can you give me an example as to
On
how
the
they do things?
regulatory process, I mean, the Netherlands is starting out saying we're not going to tax the industry at least for 4 years till we understand it, see where it's going. Do we tax it at the retail side, at the LP, whatever? But they're taking a much more pragmatic approach because we want to flip the illicit trade, the illicit market in the Netherlands to a legal market. So rather than just throw all this stuff against the wall and kill it before it even gets out of the gate, that's an example of a very pragmatic, thoughtful approach.
Well, late breaking news: Justin Trudeau makes a decision without thinking it through. I think that's been kind of his regime for the past 9 years. You talk about immigration, the housing issues in Canada, and the price. There's a lot going on within that country right now. But an election perhaps coming up, well, in the fall of 2025 could be rather sooner. But we'll see and wait and see as to how that all unfolds. But some great examples. I do want to switch now to a hot topic that has materialized in the industry over the last 4 to 5 months, which is hemp. And some say 2024 has been the year of hemp, putting the traditional cannabis industry, I think, on notice. So, question for all of you: what's the best way to approach this vertical for cannabis companies? David, I'll begin with you, knowing that Canopy Growth is no stranger when it comes to beverages.
Yeah, so look, I think that the hemp industry in the U.S. actually offers a snapshot of what we all thought cannabis was going to look like maybe 10 years ago or 8 years ago when we were
Good
thinking about
point.
it, right? Where you would have product available to consumers, to all consumers, not just consumers who are going to go into a dispensary. If you think about edibles and drinks and the bets that companies have placed on that, that was under the assumption that you would bring in consumers who aren't inhalable consumers. So if you're an inhalable consumer, you go to the dispensary, you're comfortable with it, and you might pick up a beverage or an edible just to be able to use cannabis in a different location or occasion. But the real win is when we bring new consumers in that go into a C store and say, you know what, I'll try a cannabis drink or I'll try a cannabis edible. And so to me, the hemp industry actually gives us that view as to what the industry should look like. And I'll make maybe a bit of an editorial comment on some of the industry infighting in the US between hemp derived and cannabis derived.
Yep.
And I'm going to say the consumer doesn't care. And the consumer shouldn't care, by the way. The products are exactly the same chemically. They have the same effect on you as an individual. The consumer doesn't care. And I think the industry would be well served in trying to really drive almost a bigger swath of consumer engagement and make the pie bigger than fight over cannabis versus hemp derived.
Yeah.
Right. And so to me, it's an amazing industry. I think it's something we should all be spending our time on because it could very well be the future of the kind of THC industry, if you will.
Okay, so as we see this at the side of the vertical, I guess, mature in 2025, David, like, do you see product as far as cannabis hemp-derived products like being available in consumer stores? Because we've talked about this a few times. You're going to get your flower people that go to dispensaries, but when it comes to branching out and targeting new audiences, is that a trend that you'll probably see in 2025?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. We're signing up retail accounts. Well, our Canopy USA business is doing this, but signing up retail accounts on a weekly basis now, and you can get really high quality edible products delivered to your home on a direct-to-consumer site in most states in the U.S. So it's a reality today. I think it will become, more, accepted by consumers. But yeah,
Yeah.
I think the hemp industry, or the hemp derived industry in 2025, that's the new Wild West. Weirdly, like the state by state cannabis industry in the US, that's almost become predictable because we know what's going to happen. We can kind of predict what's going to happen in each state. Now it's an execution game in those states. Hemp derived is the Wild West in the US, and it's going to be the most exciting topic in 2025.
Yeah.
I agree. Listen, I agree 100%. I think there's a couple of comments I'd like to add to what David is saying. So, first of all, you go into a state like Minnesota and they allow the hemp derived THC beverages in Total Wines, like right next to the beer offerings. And what you hear from those stores is number one, they're attracting a bunch of new consumers. And I think the stat is 20% of the consumers buying the hemp derived THC beverages are new to cannabis altogether. And they're just comfortable because they're in a store where they normally go and they're seeing the product as opposed to having to go into a dispensary. So
Yeah.
I think that is the perfect example of what David's talking about. Will expand the people in this industry. The second thing that I'll say is a CPG industry, like if it is a CPG industry, it's more common that you have like one production facility or two across the country, and you ship across the country, and you go online and you can ship to consumers, direct to consumers across the country. And that's what the hemp Delta 9 space is. You're not restricted in every state, you don't have different regulations. So it's an exciting opportunity. It is way more consistent with a regular consumer packaged good. I think this is a place that will explode. The data isn't very good, but the data that we have seen is almost as large as the actual THC market in the US from the hemp.
It is. But it's taken a lot shorter time to grow to that size of level, which I think has opened up a lot of people's eyes. Michael, Village Farms, no stranger to regulatory issues, especially taking part of the ALJ hearing, which is going to start taking place next month. Can you believe that already? Which is great. But how do you see, I guess, the hemp side of things, this issue getting resolved in 2025, like factoring in the Farm Bill? Have you paid much attention to it? And will this get resolved for better or worse in 2025?
Well, I mean, just for the audience, I mean, we operate one of the largest e-commerce platforms in the United States for cannabinoids and hemp-derived products. As you know, with Balanced Health Botanicals, our CB distillery brand, we generate millions and millions of dollars of revenue. We've been selling every state because we jumped into it upon the Farm Bill, 17 Farm Bill, which, by the way, was under the Trump administration. So as a sidebar, the Trump administration, through the 2017 Farm Bill, did more to move cannabis as a whole industry along than anything that happened in this current administration, in my opinion. So we jumped in. We've grown in the field, tens of millions of pounds of hemp. We manufacture all our own products in-house. We have one of the best-selling gummies out there, and we're in the industry every single day. So it's very much a big part of what we do. However,
Yep.
that being said, let's go back to the regulatory process. Big mistake. When hemp got regulated, everybody jumped into it. If you remember in 17, 18, the whole market basically collapsed overnight. Why? Because the legalization was one, the decriminalization was one point. But nobody came in to provide leadership to regulate the industry. The FDA said, no, not on my watch, unless Congress tells me I have to do it and funds me. The FAA, of course, they passed on it, all jokes aside. But the point is, nobody's regulating it. So lesson learned, just because legalization happens anywhere, until you know how it's going to be regulated and what those regulations are, you have to be very prudent with your capital investment because you'd be going down a different road. And that's the same thing with many states. What we're having, and then as an industry, we're acting like children. There's no adults in the room on the cannabis industry, in my opinion, in the U.S., because what the MSOs and the states are all doing through lobbying is preventing us now. We've had 5 or 6 states who have put their arms up and say, no, you can't ship in here anymore. Why not? It's legal. Well, this reason or that reason. So now they're trying to, take a prohibition attitude towards us. So it is a mess. So we're sitting back and saying, yeah, we need leadership. We need to communicate. But that's real. This is real information. We're living this day to day. New Jersey, look what, California did. And even when the governor couldn't get it through, he came out with a special, executive action on his part to block us from shipping. So we're no longer shipping there products that contain THC, which was legalized under that hemp bill. So it has to be corrected. And everybody's jumping in it. You can make CBD in your basement and sell it at 7-Eleven or at a local gas station. And it could be snake oil. And what
Yeah, I
is
know.
it doing to the consumer? What is that doing to safety? How is that showing any leadership? So that's another example of the U.S. government not taking a leadership position for whatever reason. But we need to come together as an industry. It's really
What do you think the common theme
we
is
don't
here?
work together as an industry for the better of all of us, as opposed to taking a very fragmented approach. And everybody wants to kill everybody else. So that needs to change, and we need strong voices in Washington D.C. to get our message across.
Why do you think the political landscape here in North America is so much different in comparison? Because, like, from what I'm hearing on some of the feedback you provided in the EU, they seem a lot more receptive and are thinking things through. Have they learned, I guess, a lot of things on what not to do, as we've said earlier, on how things have been rolled out? Because I was on a call right before Christmas, and the whole lobbying approach in Washington just doesn't work. And I saw firsthand there was two constituents when I made a trip to the Senate back in September, where two constituents from New Jersey that raised a couple $1 million said you had to open up the door because they couldn't get their license. Were on the verge of basically losing the company without actually opening up the doors. A 30-second conversation with Cory Booker turned into their license actually turning around, and they're granted their license within a week. So there's a lot of pressure, a lot of town hall meetings in individual states, which is going to be the right approach. I think a lot of these politicians are just completely uninformed. So saying that, what would you say, and Michael, I'll begin with you, if that does indeed happen, what do you think are the biggest trends, biggest changes that we'll see in this industry in 2025?
Well, that's a great question, and I mean, if you look, I've mentioned, and I think you've heard that from Bean and David, that the Europeans have a more pragmatic approach, but it's not without uncertainty. I mean, the EU is trying to mandate their overall viewpoint of cannabis to a lot of different countries, like states here. And I've said I wouldn't be surprised in the next 5 years if you do see other countries starting to leave the EU, like the UK did, because at some point they just get sick of people telling them what to do. But when it comes to sort of the US, it's like running a company. If you have your strategy team together and there's differences of opinion, but finally you make a decision and maybe
Yeah.
a couple of folks didn't want to go that way, well, then you better get in line and to the marching orders and go forward. And that's what we're seeing. If I think we're in Europe and in Germany, once that decision is made, everybody lined up, whether they have personal viewpoints on cannabis or not, line up and get the job done, because that's our job as public servants. In the US, it does become more political, and that's where it needs to be changed. Once the decisions are made for decriminalization or legalization, then the politicians need to line up and say, this is the decision of the people. You saw in Florida, the majority of people in Florida wanted legalization. The politicians had already changed the law recently to say, no, you need 60%. And
Yeah,
by
I
the way,
know.
when they got that vote for 60, they didn't get 60% to change the law to 60%. How crazy is that? So you got to listen to the people and do your job as a public servant.
Love it when DeSantis said the next day, the people of Florida have spoken. Yet 58% voted in favor for it. But
Yeah, it's crazy.
that if you want to tell me you work in the cannabis industry, there's a prime
Yeah.
example.
They
But
should have said, well, we won't change the law then because we didn't even get 60 ourselves. And basically what they said is we know better than the citizens, right? The elected officials.
common theme we always heard. David, look, I know there's been a lot of focus and change that you guys have made in the U.S. market. And let's face it, that is a big opportunity there. It's probably the biggest opportunity if legislation obviously starts to get implemented. Outside of all that, how are you prepping for 2025 and best preparing as a company?
Yeah, I think it's improving execution everywhere. Everything we've talked about today. I think we know we're in an industry where we're whipsawed around by regulatory affairs, and so I think the first thing you have to do, as a CPG person that, 5 years ago came into this industry, the first thing you have to do is to understand the industry, which is we do have these constraints, and you need to operate within the constraints and execute as best you can and be prepared if there is movement in the US on regulatory reform, for
Yes.
example, or
Yeah.
if there's movement in Canada on excise reform, or movement in Germany as they're rolling out their regulatory model. So I think you have to execute what you have today and be prepared for what's happening in the future. Unlike the job in any other industry, it's just do what you can today, but then be prepared for massive change. And I think everybody who survived up to this
Good
point
point.
in this industry is really good at dealing with uncertainty, because that's the only way we've made it this far. And so I think we're all, I'll speak for myself, but we have to double down on that going into 2025, because
Yeah.
that's not going to change in the near term.
Yeah. Well, new administration comes in, Bina, come January 20th, 2025. A lot of optimism pertaining to the industry, and it's badly needed, knowing the previous administration is just the status quo for 4 consecutive years. But there has been some encouraging signs with Donald Trump saying that, let's face it, Republicans look at this from an economic perspective and the amount of jobs that'll create within the actual economy, which is pretty telling, to say the least. I also learned, too, that Schedule 1 is where cannabis is right now, and none of these jobs within the cannabis industry are actually registered on the jobs reports. So that, to me, is a real eye-opener, which should be huge for another incentive for him to move. So, look, you made a big acquisition before Christmas with Motif Labs and became, big player within the Canadian market. Great acquisition. But you've also indicated as well recently that you're looking at US opportunities. I've asked this question to David and Michael about trends that we see in 2025. How much is that a focal point? And is some of these 2025 trends playing into like that decision of looking at US opportunities for you?
So listen, I think when we got the $124.6 million follow-on investment from British American Tobacco, we set up an $83 million fund to go internationally to invest. And besides Germany that we invested in, we are focused on the US. It is a big market. We have to do things in the US. The challenge is finding how to do it compliantly. And while I know David's found a way, and we've seen Sundial do stuff as well, we see the Delta 9 space as the easy, low-hanging fruit, right? This is compliant. You can consolidate. So that is an area that we think is interesting, and agreed. It's a bit of a patchwork of regulations right now, but between states, some have banned it outright. But for us, being a Canadian player, you don't need all the states in the U.S. It's a big market compared to Canada. You just got to get a few that are regulated in, that have said they're going to be in Delta 9, and we think there's an opportunity there. In terms of regulation changes, I mean, rescheduling, that's been a bit of a, hope and dream for a couple of years, and maybe Trump will get it pushed through to Schedule 3. In the end, I think any news towards legalization, whether it's another state going to direct legalization, whether there's rescheduling, it'll raise the overall cannabis market. I think we saw the reverse when Florida went negative. We all took the hit in the market. I think there is a need to see some progress, and progress is good for the whole industry. And I look forward to perhaps seeing some movement. I mean, if there's anything, Trump is somebody who's going to shake things up and make some decisions.
I don't know if there's a silver lining in Amendment 3 not passing, but it seems like Privio gotten off their butts and have really come together to get the messaging through, because the moment of truth is now for the industry. But, saying that, last thing I'll ask, Michael, if rescheduling were to get announced, we all know that doesn't provide uplisting for some of these U.S. exchanges, but if there is proper legislation and the proper wording that allows some of these companies to list on senior exchanges, what's something that you have already established at Village Farms, how does that change your approach and company as a whole?
For the better. I mean, look, first of all, let me say that I am a credible supporter of the Trump administration across the board for nearly everything. And I do believe he will recognize cannabis. I do. I'm a believer in him. I voted for him twice. And that's just not a personal feeling. As I said in my earlier comments, if you compare what occurred at the end of his last administration and the current administration, there's no comparison. based on a conversation with him. The other thing is we all know here on this call that the U.S. is the big market.
Yeah.
We're running parallel strategies, but ultimately waiting for the U.S. market. And we think we will do well. We have thousands of acres of assets available in the U.S. market. And that coupled with the fact that I believe it's all an experiment now. Legalization, eventual comprehensive legalization is a game changer for how things are done at the state level. It's going to be a whole new ball game. And in the end, it's going to be the same fundamentals that drive profitability. So I don't think any of us are behind, being second or third or even 10 years entering the market later. It all depends on regulation. And with regulation, I'll say, we are we're the only cannabis companies that's picked to testify with the DEA, which is starting next month. Of the 25 companies picked, only cannabis producer. And 2 weeks later, we sued the DEA. Now, I'm an American citizen, a patriot, served my country 32 years, take no pride in leading a company to sue the U.S. government or a division. But we are putting our money where our mouth is. We're spending big bucks on this. We have a lot of people focused on it internally in the company. And we're going to testify because we need that first step of legalization. I mean, fentanyl is a Schedule II. So why is cannabis?
Tell me about it.
It's another insane.
That's why I've always said a small incremental step in this space right now would actually be massive.
So we're going to do everything we can to push that going forward, and we're doing it. And we'll be testifying January 30th. And our lawsuit is about getting a fair shake.
Yeah,
not having it. Just want to have a fair shake. So we're fighting that effort on behalf of the industry. So yeah, we think 25, we're starting out with a bang and we'll go for it. And I think some of the leading Canadian companies will do well eventually in the U.S. market. And I can't say that about other Canadian industries in the past, but I think for cannabis, I think we'll all have a role going forward, and I'm excited about that.
Yeah. Hopefully we get some cross-examination during that ALJ hearing too. That would be nice, but that remains to be seen. Best of luck with that. I think a lot of people will be rooting for yourself during that hearing. But David, last thing I'll leave with you. If we're having this conversation 12 months from now, what do you think are the biggest trends that we'll see? Everybody obviously already knows what your approach is to the U.S. market. Done a bang-up job, obviously, with Jetta, Wana, and the closing acreage right before the holiday season. But saying that, moving forward, 12 months from now, what do you think, in your perspective, as to, like I've said before, yes, how you're preparing for 2025, but we're having the same interview 12 months from now. What stands out to you most?
Well, let me actually maybe look at it from a more hopeful standpoint than we often do in the industry. Look, if we get some momentum at the federal level in the U.S., I think there'll be a little bit of wind in the sails of all the cannabis players. I mean, right now, the market has completely abandoned cannabis. If you look at and look, I think it's a little bit of the shift from a lot of our retail investors are also crypto investors. And so crypto's the hot thing right now. I think we just need a couple of wins. And Bina said this earlier, we need a couple of wins. We need rescheduling to happen. We need there to be momentum around hemp, even if it's to push it back to the States, like momentum around hemp. We could use some help, as we talked about earlier, in Canada. If we get any one of those things happening, I think this industry will feel a lot better 12 months from now than it does today. And I'm actually reasonably hopeful that we'll get movement on a couple of those things, and then we can all play our hands from there. And look, I also want to reiterate what Michael said. I think that the Canadian LPs, we got all the press in the early days of legal cannabis, and then we kind of got relegated a little bit, compared to many of the MSOs. I actually think there are several Canadian LPs that are super well positioned in Canada, in the US, and in international markets. And so, I'm hopeful that we have a reasonable regulatory year so that we can all be sitting here looking at a super bright future.
Here's something I'd like to learn before I go. And Michael, I'll ask you this question. If you're able to enter into the U.S. market, you also have the international opportunity. EU GMP graded, basically product that you're shipping into into Europe in places like Holland, Germany, UK, Poland, all those types of countries that are at the forefront right now. How quickly do the US companies get involved in that? And what's the timeline to get up to speed with all the framework that you've put in place to build out like that? That's because like you're talking about Canada, you're talking about internationally over in Europe, and then as well, obviously the US market too. But it takes time if you want to enter a new market, something you've already established. And like maybe help explain or understand, I guess, the overall process if a US company does eventually want to venture into that market. What would they be looking at, and what are they up against, knowing that you've established yourself already?
Yeah, well, on one hand, I would say, like anything else, it always seems easier than it actually is.
I
So
bet.
it's
I
been a
bet.
struggle for all of us to get to this point, as you know. So I think obviously they'll have an opportunity, but it's not going to be that easy. And then what will resonate is really at some point, like any other markets we go in there will be commoditization. I've said that from the beginning in this industry, and price compression. So at the end of the day, can they compete? And I don't think the model in the U.S. today, the single state model, where costs of production, those many of those operators would never make it in Canada. No way. That's not going to be easy because, like anything else, especially when it has a farming side to an agriculture side, those commoditize out. So I would say they better make sure that their investment will pay off in a long-term basis. And we have a huge advantage in Canada. As you know, in Canada, we are one of the lowest cost producers anywhere. So on the other hand, if they go to the illicit trade, guys, both in Canada and the US, they probably do well because what I was going to say earlier is there's a lot of product going to Europe, both from the US and Canada, especially Canada, both countries, container loads of illegal product.
Hmm.
How is that happening? How is that getting out of the ports? How is it getting on airplanes?
Yeah.
Where is the enforcement here? And that's another example, coming back to the earlier conversation. We need interaction, we need enforcement. So those guys are doing well. And of course, they're bypassing all the regulations, taxes, 280E in the US, excise tax in Canada. But just to get another point in about a lack of enforcement everywhere.
Yeah. Do you think we correct it eventually, Bina, one day, where we look at this and say the black market is no longer around? They're always going to be around in some sort of capacity, but a lot smaller scale from where we're experiencing today.
I think so. I think that if the economics are right, we're growing cannabis at very low costs right now, just by necessity. The companies have had to figure out how to do it efficiently, and we've got lower costs. What's jamming us now is the pricing. We could match the illicit market. It's the excise that's the challenge. So I think, to Michael's point, I think we're very well versed for global expansion because we know how to grow and we know how to do it efficiently because we've had to. I think the other thing that I just want to throw in is we've also done some work on innovation. And I think this is a place where there's an opportunity to compete against the illicit market by bringing in things that are more innovative that they're not going to do. Like flower, yes, you're going to get it, but we've just launched a nano emulsion gummy that we've done a PK study, $3 million to be able to substantiate a claim on onset and bioavailability. And for us, that opens up the door to international markets. You bring in something, you bring in IP, differentiated, you offer consumers something they can't get in the illicit market. I think we have to see more of that. We have to see more innovation. And it's tough when you have so much going to excise tax or to, that you can't invest in it, but that's how you win. You bring new products that consumers appreciate, that they can understand. One of the things we hear in the US, the feedback from consumers, they're looking for a more predictable experience with cannabis. There are ways to provide that more predictable, and that is what we have to start listening to consumers, behaving like consumer packaged goods companies, and investing in that innovation that'll make a difference. So I'm hopeful that those changes will happen. I like to be optimistic at this time of year, and see that what will be like by the end of 25, I think we'll be in a better place.
Here's my bold predictions in a year from now. I think we have a new prime minister in Canada. I also think rescheduling will get announced, and I think conversations will be made publicly, but won't be finalized for banking in the U.S. That's where I think we are in 12 months from now. Wishful thinking, But that's
Shad, one clarification on my comment. Just not all MSOs would not. There are some MSOs in the U.S. that I like their business model for export to Canada, assuming they can get EU GMP certification. Guys like Glasshouse who have a large footprint, because ultimately I think large scale, low cost with high quality is the way to go. So not all, but when you look at some of the smaller operators within the state, that's where the cost differential will be. So just a clarification there. And I like your projections, by the way, for
I think a lot of people would. Last thing I'll leave, which is the most important question I wanted to ask all of you. Bean, I'll begin with you. Is Die Hard a Christmas holiday movie?
I absolutely think so. Absolutely. Yes.
Michael, what do you think?
Absolutely.
All right. David?
I don't know. It happens at Christmas. You know, I'm more of a Grinch, Jim Carrey Grinch kind of person. So,
well, listen, I hope everybody got some great dialogue off of this. Hope you all had a great Christmas and enjoy this holiday season. But really appreciate some intel and direction. I know a lot of our viewers. Leave some comments below. Let us know what you thought of this. Anything you agree, disagree, any information you want to learn from these three thought leaders in the space, let us know by leaving some comments below. Enjoy the rest of your holiday season, and all the best to all of you in 2025. And we'll see you on the other side of 2025. In the meantime, happy holidays, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
David, Bina, Shad, see you.
Bye-bye.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching our latest podcast. What'd you all think? Is there any information that we're missing? Is there anything you want us to cover? As these industries heat up, we're getting access to more and more big hosts. So let us know the questions that you want us to ask for you. As usual, smash that like button. We want this to go viral. Click on that bell for all notifications for the latest interviews that we're doing. And as usual, let's build this community. Subscribe to our channel because we appreciate it, because we wouldn't be here without you. Thanks for watching, everyone.